Hi there. Today we're going to take a flight in a Mooney from the Raleigh Executive Jetport in Sanford, North Carolina, that's Tango Tango Alpha, over to Whiskey 95, which is the Ocracoke Island Airport on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The airplane we're using today is a 1993 Mooney M20J MSE. The MSE is a regular J model with a typical 200 horsepower, normally aspirated Lycoming IO360 engine. The MSE was manufactured beginning in 1990 and included some avionics and interior upgrades over the older 201 versions of the same airframe, along with some much improved electric cowl flaps that replaced the old school closed, open, and trail position design. Those are continuously variable now. And also the wing flap switch has been replaced with a switch that has three distinct positions, and that's up, approach flaps, and then full flaps. Otherwise, this airplane, the MSE, performs just like any other J model Mooney. So this is me a few months ago with this airplane. It was a hot summer day, and I had just completed a check ride, or a flight review, I should say, in this airplane with my instructor. And it was a hot day, and you can see I'm a little sweaty there, not only from the hot day, but he put me through quite a workout. And it was good practice to get up to speed in the Mooney and stay proficient. That's very important in this airplane. Oh, and there's one more thing about me. I am not a flight instructor. I have a commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating, but I am not an instructor. So this video is made just for the fun of us making it for you, and we hope that you get some kind of enjoyment out of it, but it's not intended to be instruction. If you need flight instruction in your Mooney or any other kind of flight instruction, go out and find a flight instructor and have a good time. And this here is our co-pilot for this trip. He is a very accomplished pilot in our Piper Warrior that we own together, and he is looking to get checked out in the Mooneys and enjoys learning about them and flying with me in them. So that's the two of us for this trip here today. So on our departure here, as we pull out of Raleigh Executive Airport, you're going to notice a couple of things. First, the stall warning on this particular airplane sounds off at about 10 knots above the actual stall. I'm using approach flaps for departure, so our stall speed is a knot or two above the 55 knot VSO at max weight, but we're a bit lighter than that today, so 55 is probably about right for our stall. The book recommends lifting the nose at 63 knots, and that does cause the horn to sound briefly, but don't worry, we're well above an actual stall here as we depart. As we climb out here and get the gear up and the flaps up and the power set and the prop set and all those things, I want to talk a little bit about flying the Mooney, and particularly about landing the Mooney. If you hang around the airport long enough, you'll eventually hear pilots talk about Mooney's reputation for being difficult to land, and more specifically, floating on landing. And this can be true if you attempt to land a Mooney with too much energy. And by energy, I mean airspeed. Mooneys, much more than any other similar airplane, really, they are unforgiving to pilots who do not exercise precise airspeed control. Just a few knots too much on the landing, and that landing distance will increase dramatically, even exceeding the available runway length in some scenarios. This is because of Mooney's slick aerodynamics, their wing design, short landing gear with its associated dramatic ground effect, and other factors. Adding to all this, if a pilot tries to force a floating Mooney onto the ground before it's ready and ends up with a flat or slightly nose-first landing, the firm and bouncy rubber donut suspension design, coupled with the relatively aft location of the nose wheel, will absolutely result in a bounce, a pilot-induced oscillation, and a prop strike on the second bounce, or maybe the third bounce if you're lucky. Mooney pilots must always touch down at the right airspeed, nose up, and always keep a go-around in your pocket, ready to go if needed. Here at this point in the flight, we're headed out over the Pamlico Sound. It looks like a lot of water because it really is. It's about 20 miles from the mainland of North Carolina, across the water out to Ocracoke Island. You can see the Outer Banks here in the extreme right corner of that side window. It doesn't look like much, it's a real thin piece of land, and from this viewpoint, it really is kind of intimidating to see how small it really is. But we'll be there in just a moment. As we get set up for our pattern here, or our pattern entry, and Brian takes a couple of cool photographs, let's talk about speeds a little bit. The speeds I like to use work out to about 100 knots in the downwind, about 80 knots for the turns to base and final, and then 71 knots on a stabilized final. Notice I said about when describing the speeds leading up to final, but exactly 71 knots on final. This is critical, as I said earlier, because any extra energy, even 2 or 3 or 5 extra knots of speed, will positively result in an extended floating landing with the far end of the runway getting larger in the windscreen at an alarming rate. The book suggests 71 knots for a very good reason. VSO in this airplane, which is the stall speed with the landing configuration and is shown as the bottom of the wide arc on the airspeed indicator, is 55 knots. So the recommended 71 knots is right at the 1.3 times VSO that is standard conventional wisdom for most light airplanes. Nothing unusual about the speed itself, except for the importance of sticking to it. Another interesting thing about speed control on approach in a Mooney is I've found that more than in any other airplane I've flown, Mooneys will come down extra well if you find yourself a little high on approach by pulling the nose up just an additional degree or two and getting the speed down to the mid to high 60s. The descent rate will increase perfectly without picking up any extra energy that you just end up having to figure out how to get rid of later, which would defeat the whole purpose. If you're a bit high and give in to the urge to point the nose down, you'll pick up speed and float, float, float. All right, now it's time to configure the airplane for landing. We're abeam the touchdown point at traffic pattern altitude at about 100 knots, and I like to go through this 7-point flow that gets me from the downwind, basically cruise configuration, into the landing configuration. And the 7 steps begin with putting down the landing gear. So that's number 1 is gear down. Number 2, turn on the fuel boost pump. Number 3, adjust the power. Right now we've got the power set to about 16 inches of manifold pressure and probably about 2300 RPM. And as we pull the power back, it comes off the prop governor, and any further reduction in power is going to result in a reduction in RPM. So we bring our power back from about 16 inches of manifold pressure down to the top of the yellow arc, which we'll talk about in a minute. The next thing is number 4, the prop control. That goes full forward and ready for a go around if needed. Number 5 is the mixture, full rich. Number 6, cowl flaps. Put those cowl flaps open, again, ready for a go around if necessary. And finally, wing flaps. And this is when you go down to the first notch of flaps, which is for approach. the airport today is 2,998 feet long and 60 feet wide. That's plenty of runway, but it's short enough to deserve a little bit of extra thought. Looking at the pilot's operating handbook, we find an estimated 1,550 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle on landing, but only a ground roll of 680 feet. That's pretty short, and the airport is right off the beach and is surrounded only by low, brushy plants and sand, so we don't have to worry about clearing obstacles coming in here. We're only thinking about that ground roll of 680 feet. Let's see how we do. I want to talk about that yellow arc a little bit in the power. You'll see I'm kind of using it a little bit. The factory Lycoming engine and Macaulay propeller combination requires attention to that yellow caution range on the tachometer to be avoided between 1,500 RPM and 1,900, I think it's 1,950 RPM. Extended operation in this range, which is really more than just passing through it, creates a harmonic vibration that could damage the crankshaft counterweights in the engine. It seems onerous, but it isn't really. When I reduce power as part of the 7-step pre-landing flow, I bring the power down, as I said earlier, off the prop governor, such that any further reduction of power results in a reduction of RPM. That's about 1,900 or so, just above that yellow arc on the tack. On short final, once the runway's made, I bring the power down through the yellow arc, down to about 1,400 or 1,500 RPM, and keep it there until the round out. On this landing at Ocracoke Island, with a stiff headwind of about 20 knots, I made this power reduction a little early. I immediately recognized my mistake and brought the power back up again just above the yellow arc for a moment, and then back down. With no obstacles to worry about, I began the round out just as we crossed over the beginning of the pavement. With the airspeed under control at 71 knots and then a few knots less, I had plenty of speed to fly safely, but not so much to create any float at all. The mains touched down on the numbers, and we ended up with a long, slow taxi all the way down the remaining runway to the lone exit at the far end. Keep in mind that the stall warning on this particular airplane seems to sound off about 10 knots above the stall, so that's about 65 knots. You'll hear it here as I enter the round out. So if you're paying attention, you might be starting to understand the importance of precise airspeed control in these Mooney airplanes. Do that, and your Mooney will reward you with precise, controllable, smooth landings every time with no floating at all.